Hey guys, Naz here with another tutorial. So today I'm going to be showing you how to make a crystal effect on any kind of plush or on any piece of fabric really. Now I'll go into a bit more detail later, but you don't really want to be doing this on very long pile fabrics. The shorter the pile, the neater and sort of sharper the result is going to be. So I'm going to show you guys how it looks on a finished plush piece, on a piece of fleece, some shaved luxury shag, and then I also test some teddy fur as well, so just different lengths of fur. So what you're going to need is you're going to need some masking tape, some scissors, and you're going to need an airbrush and some appropriate paints to airbrush your fabric. So personally I use Createx paints. I've started to transition over to using golden fluid acrylics, so I'm trying to use up all my Createx paint so that I can start using the golden fluid acrylics, and those can be washed. So from what I've heard, they're really fantastic for airbrushing on faux fur, and they can last through many washes. They heat set without the use of like a very strong heat source, so it will naturally form sort of a cohesive bond to the fabric, and it's not just going to wash out like your acrylics or other sorts of paints. So they are one that I would really recommend if you don't already have something available, but you can always airbrush with something like the Createx that are made for airbrushing, or you could use something like watered down acrylic paints if that's what you'd like to use. So first off, you're going to prepare the piece that you're going to be airbrushing. So here I'm going to be airbrushing this spare cadence head that I just had lying around. I've gone ahead and I've used 2 layers of clear tape to mask her eyes off, because I definitely don't want any of this paint to get into her embroidery. It'll be nearly impossible to get that out if it does go in there. So the reason that I like to use clear tape is so that I can see if any paint is starting to leak underneath, and it's also quite water repellent. So I've gone ahead and I've added pins all around the edge, so every couple of millimeters, just to make sure that that tape is not going to lift and peel up as it is naturally inclined to do. So that'll really make sure that that tape is pressed tight against that embroidery and no paint is going to get in and under that. But obviously be careful, if you're really heavy-handed you might still be able to get some paint seeping under there. So just work in thin layers and always watch that there's no paint going into embroidery or any places that you don't want it to. I've also prepared a piece of fleece, which you don't really need to do anything to, and I've also shaved down some luxury shag fur. I will also, after this point in filming, I also got out a piece of teddy fur and I shaved that down a little bit too and tested it. You'll see the results on each of them at the end. But now what you're going to do, and it's the same process for every single piece that you will be working on, is we're going to start putting tiny little sort of shard shaped stencils with the tape all over the plush or the fabric or whatever you happen to be airbrushing on. I personally like to do the airbrushing after the plush or piece of fabric is sewn together. You just get a much neater transition over the seams. If you do it while the fabric is still flat, you can, but I find that when the seams, when you sew one piece to another piece, you're going to have sort of mixed matched shard sort of lines over your seams. So it really just curves much nicer around the plush if you do it after the plush is sewn, but it's really your choice. Also I find that with some paints a lot of handling can sort of distress the paint job, so if you have to go through the whole process of sewing the plush after you have done the airbrushing, it can sort of rough up the airbrushed texture that you've put all that hard work into, so I would suggest doing that afterwards. I would also say that this technique is not something that I would do on a plush that would be handled by children or really roughed around or played with a lot. As I said before, the paint can sort of rub off depending on what kind of paint you're using. So this is definitely more of a technique for a display plush or a delicate plush. If you're planning on using this technique on something like a fursuit, definitely have a look into using those fluid acrylics that last really well, and make sure to not put it somewhere like your feet or your hands or somewhere that's going to be roughed and scuffed up a lot. Try and put it somewhere that isn't going to come under that sort of abuse. So you can see here I'm just cutting a gazillion pieces of masking tape. I prefer to use masking tape for doing this rather than duct tape. I think duct tape is too strong. Masking tape's kind of a nice in-between. You want it to be able to stick to your fabric, but when you eventually pull it off later, you want it to be able to easily come off. So I find that if you did do this with duct tape, it's going to sort of really grab onto those fibres, and especially if you're using something like faux fur, it's not really going to want to come off. So you can see here what I'm doing, and it's a fairly long, sort of tedious process, but it doesn't really require too much brain power, is I'm just making lots of different diagonal cuts in this tape and cutting out little pieces that are in the shape of shards, so like triangles or squares or just anything sort of diagonal and shard shaped. So you just want points, you want random, you don't want any curves, you just want lots of little sharp shapes that you can then stick onto the fabric surface that you're going to be airbrushing. And this is going to be the lightest part of our airbrushed pattern, so this is going to make sure that whatever fabric underneath retains its original colour. So if you want the pieces, for example, on this fleece to remain white, these shards are going to be the portion that does stay white as we airbrush. Now I would recommend trying to make this pattern as random as possible. You want to have some big shards, some little shards, sort of spice things up a bit. When you're doing this on a plush, just keep an eye on where you're sticking the pieces. Make sure that you're not forming any sort of weird shapes, or you might accidentally give her shard eyebrows, or you really don't want to make things too busy around the eyes or the mouth or things like that. So just keep an eye, try and keep it random, and just keep in your mind what it's going to look like. You don't want to sort of make any sort of weird shapes that people are going to notice. You want it to really look random and not draw attention to anywhere that you don't want it to. So just a really long process, but put on a movie or listen to some music and just cut out a heap of these shard shapes and cover your entire plush or piece of fabric before we get onto airbrushing. Before you start sticking this tape on, I would also recommend to make sure that your nap is facing down and is brushed really nicely. It's sort of in the position that you would want it on the final plush or the final piece of fabric. Don't be afraid to overlap these shapes, it just adds to sort of the random nature of the shards. So go a bit crazy with the pattern and try and make it as random as possible. So now we're on to the actual airbrushing. You're going to need a whole bunch of pieces of either cardboard, or you might use a ruler, or you just need something that's straight and something that's not going to absorb a whole lot of water. The best thing that I've found is things like magazine covers. They're sort of that glossy paper that repels water really nicely. You just need something that we're going to be airbrushing straight lines against. Here's the Createx paint that I like to use. I'm just going to be diluting this with Windex for the purpose of this tutorial. So you've got your airbrush all set up, you've tested what colour you're going to be using. One thing that I'll note here is I just picked pink because I like pink and it's just a random colour, but if I was doing this on Cadence I would sort of test the colours out a bit more. This is definitely too bright a pink for that particular character. If you go back to the start and see the crystal Cadence that I made originally, she has a much more subdued kind of purpley pink, but it's nowhere near the saturation that this colour I'm airbrushing with is now. But also I wanted to sort of have it a very bright dark colour so you guys could see what I was doing. Now what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be airbrushing lines in every single direction. So we're going to be using, in this case I'm just using a little piece of cardboard and making sure that no paint really beads up on the top of or the bottom of your little straight piece here, because you don't want to have a whole bunch of paint welling up underneath and then you accidentally smear that all over your piece of fabric, because that'll sort of ruin the effect. And this is just really simple airbrushing. If you're just starting out, this is actually a really easy project because you're just following the straight line of that piece of cardboard. So you can see I've just got one here that's a little bit bigger than those smaller pieces, and you're really just creating this really random sort of zigzag pattern. You don't want it to be symmetrical anyway, you sort of just want to keep going. It's going to look a bit weird to start with. You can see here you don't have to go all the way across the entire piece of fabric. I'm just breaking everything up with these lines, and by airbrushing up against that sort of solid straight piece, one edge is going to be really sharp and the other is going to sort of taper out into that gradient, and that's sort of mimicking the look of a gem or a diamond or a crystal or something like that. They have all these sort of reflective lines. You can see the more lines you add, the better and better it's starting to look. It definitely looked kind of ugly when you first start out and just looks like a bunch of lines, but the more random you make it, the better. And all you have to do is make sure that you're adding straight lines, not curved lines. Look for where the pattern sort of might be a bit too open, and then you can add a line here or there, and just keep going until you think it looks really good. So in this case, I'm wanting to sort of create like a pink diamond or a pink shattered gem kind of effect. So I don't want too much of that white of the fleece actually showing. It's a good idea to start with a lighter colour than you want the finished piece of fabric to turn out like, because after all this airbrushing, this piece isn't going to really look like a white character anymore. It's going to look like a pink character. So the lighter colour you start out with, the brighter your highlights are going to be. So if you try not to go with something too sort of medium to darker tone, try and start off with the lightest possible colour that you want inside your pattern. So for example, with Cadence, I would start with a very light pink minky, and then do the pink airbrushing over the top, and that would darken everything up a little bit. So just keep in mind your starting colour might not be the same sort of tone or the same darkness as the final colour you want it to turn out. You can see here that I also did a general airbrush just to get rid of any of the white, sort of bright white that was left. Now I've just gone ahead and used my hairdryer and dried all of it, so I can be confident in touching it that I'm not going to smear it. And I'm just going to start peeling off all those pieces of tape, and you can see that that's revealing sort of the highlights of our gem pattern here. It can be a little bit tricky to peel it off, but you'll get there. Make sure that you don't leave this tape on probably for more than one night. I've had masking tape on pieces of Mickey that I've sent in the post, and after a couple of weeks it was like permanently fused to the Minky, so you don't want to leave it on there for too long because it can bond to the point where you can't peel it off anymore. But if you just leave it overnight, it should be fine. If you're going to be leaving it for more than one night, I'd say, you know, you should probably try and make it all happen in one day, because that masking tape can start to peel up by itself just because of the nature of the tape. Now you can see here I'm just airbrushing and getting rid of some of those bright whites and going in and enhancing some of those sort of gradient areas just by hand, just wherever I think it would look nice to have sort of a little bit darker of a gradient. And you can see that's pretty much the final effect. You can go in and add some more lines if you want. I'd say be careful not to go too crazy. I think I overworked this one a little bit. I should have stopped and just not added any more lines. But here you can see essentially what the effect is going to look like, and fleece is really probably tied with Minky for the easiest fabrics that there are to do this effect on. So I really wanted to see if this could be done on fur. And it is definitely possible, but you really just need a short pile fur. So I would recommend shaving or doing this on shaved areas. If you're doing it on long pile fur, it really sort of softens the effect and you're not going to get those hard lines that you need to have that crystal look. So I'd like to see this on maybe ears or a face, or you could even have it down a tummy sort of thing, anywhere that's going to have sort of a shorter fur effect. And I'm going through the exact same process. It's really the same on any fabric you apply this to. The only thing that I will say is when you're airbrushing faux fur, be careful with the air pressure, because it can, if you blow air from the bottom of the nap up, it'll sort of tussle the fibres of the fur. So you want to be shooting from the top of the nap downwards so the air is blowing in the direction of the nap of the fur, and that's going to stop it from just like flowing everywhere and getting messy as you're airbrushing it. So exact same process. I'm going to finish this up and we'll do the same with a couple of other pieces. I'd really recommend thoroughly testing your paint colour before you do this on a finished piece that you can't take it back on, because I found that some colours can really be too dark, or your colour might dry overnight, so that it can really lighten up after sort of 24 hours of truly thoroughly drying, not just drying with your hairdryer. So you really want to test first, even test it the day before, leave it overnight and just make sure that you're happy with that colour, because it can really differ with a lot of different factors. So you want to make sure that you're really going to be happy with it, because if you're doing this on a whole plush, if the colour's wrong, you can't really wash it off and take it back and get it back to that pure, un-airbrushed form. So yeah, definitely thoroughly test before you do any of this. And here we go, airbrushing on a sort of finished sewn plush piece. I'm just going over the exact same process. You can see I'm probably doing a little bit smaller lines to help curve around that very round head shape, but really it's exactly the same. And sort of as I mentioned before with your placement of the shards, be careful with the directions of your lines and the density of your lines going around different areas of especially the face. Again, you don't want to do something like give her something like a shape that looks like an eyebrow, or something that messes up with the shape of her smile or anything like that. So just keep in mind when you're airbrushing around those areas, you don't want to go too crazy. Don't make something super dark around her mouth or anything like that. So really it's just a very simple process, going ahead and airbrushing line, 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 random, 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 different direction sort of thing. And then going over the whole plush. I personally like to give the whole thing a little bit of a gentle spray over, just so that those highlights that are under the tape are going to be the brightest part of the pattern. You don't have to do that, but that's just something that I've figured out that I particularly like when I'm making things like this. This colour is definitely way too dark for if I was making a Princess Cadence. She is much more of a pale pink, as I mentioned earlier. So it might look a bit like she's sunburned or something in the finished product, but I did want to have a bright kind of colour to show you guys exactly how this would look. And here I am just testing it on a piece of teddy fabric. The right hand side is unshaven and the left hand side is shaven, and that just sort of gives you an idea of the effect of a longer pile versus a shorter pile. The one on the right you can still sort of see the effect, but on the left it's definitely a nicer, sort of sharper look for the particular pattern. One thing you can do is either hair dry this or let it dry for a few hours before you decide to pick the tape off. So now I'm going to pick the tape off of Cadence here. It's very satisfying to sort of reveal the final pattern after all that hard work, and it just really shines sort of after you remove those pieces of tape. I would say that the plush isn't its final colour until you've let it dry for about 24 hours, so I would probably not take photos of the finished plush until you've let it dry for at least that long. So here we have all the finished pieces. So we have shaved and unshaven teddy fur. Then we have a piece of fleece, which is probably the sharpest version of the pattern. We also have a piece of shaved luxury shag in sort of that warmer pink. I don't really like this colour combination of those two particular pinks. And here we have the finished plush. So you can see a couple of bits where I've accidentally smudged, got paint where I don't want it to. It sort of blurs the lines of the pattern, so that's sort of an example of what can go wrong if you let that paint bead on your straight lined piece. But yeah, that's pretty much what it looks like. I hope you guys make a bunch of crystal ponies. I haven't seen very many people make them, so I'm really hoping this encourages people to give them a go. If you do end up using this tutorial, please tag me or send me a picture of what you make with it. I really want to see more people using this technique. And as always, credit is always super appreciated, or just a little name drop reference to where people can find the tutorial. Any sort of shout outs really help me make more videos, and it's really appreciated. But anyway, I hope you guys learnt a lot, and if you have any questions, if I've left anything out, don't hesitate to send me a private message on social media or Patreon, and I'll help you out as soon as I can. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!